when they would cut manuscripts with write blue pencil out things. But that was mainly unusual, and they said to me that most manuscripts had already been vetted, had been censored before they even arrived at the offices of the censors, and that therefore they did not cut a great deal. Why? Well, first of all, what was the process of publishing a book in East Germany? Almost never did authors turn in finished books to a publisher. It's very interesting. Instead, they would have an idea, or the editor in the publishing house would have an idea. They would discuss it together. The author might write a chapter or a few passages. He would go to the editor and they would discuss it. Now, the editor is a member of the Communist Party who is going to make sure that nothing would be printed that would offend the party line. And the party line is laid down by, well, Honecker, the head of the Communist Party, the Politburo, the Central Committee, and meetings that occurred once every 4 years. There is a very interesting word in German used by the censors all the time. The word is Parteilichkeit. The party line, accepting the party line. Every manuscript had to have Parteilichkeit. So, yes, they're in favor of quality of writing. They operated in some ways like readers in publishing houses today, but they enforced the party line. And all of the conflicts occurred around this problem. Does the manuscript adequately conform to the party line, or does it deviate? And how much does it deviate? It's a process of constant negotiation with the author, with the editor in the publishing house. Then it's sent out to readers, and they act as censors as well. So I've read many letters from readers to the editor in the publishing house. And finally, a big dossier is made. It's sent to the censorship office in East Berlin, and the censors go through it, and they can cut out words. It ultimately becomes part of the plan, and at last it's published. But even then, it could offend party members, because the party has opposing extremes, and hardliners within the party might not like a book that appears and causes a little bit of scandal. So all of this appears in the archives of the Communist Party. I went into the party archives after I met the censors, and they too had never seen an American. I just walked in and said, "Could I consult your archives, please?" This is the Central Committee of the Communist Party. They didn't know what to do with me, but the state, again, no longer existed. So they said, well, okay. I began filling out forms and getting actual reports, again, by the censors and by everyone who participated in the system. I don't have time to tell you about them. But my point is, I realized when I interviewed the censors that a great deal of self-justification went into what they told me, and yet they were true believers. They believed in socialism with a human face, and they believed literature should be part of building socialism. And it was much better than what we had in America, which was full of garbage. So the point I'm trying to make is censors are not idiots. These were people who had PhDs in German literature. They knew Goethe and Schiller backwards and forwards. And their censorship, in their eyes, was also positive. Now, when I got into the archives, I found some very compromising information, including information about the two censors I had interviewed. For example, they expelled another member from their office because he was too soft on manuscripts that did not fill the party line, and their hero, the head of the censorship office, wrote a memo in 1978 in which he opposed a proposal to publish the works of Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher, and I'm now quoting his memo. If Kierkegaard belongs to our literary heritage, then so do Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Freud. Besides, in deciding what can be published from late bourgeois philosophy, we want, first of all, to take into account the situation in the ideological class war. We have had enough of individualistic attitudes to life and lifestyles, end quote. So, no, you can't read Freud in East Germany. You can't read Nietzsche. You can't read Schopenhauer. You can't read Kafka. I mean, a great deal of literature is outside the bounds of what is permissible. So, okay, we're building socialism, but it's not as if it's an open and tolerant system at all. And I could give you examples of scandals and so on. We don't have time to do that. I would just mention one example, and if there's time for questions, I can mention others. Yeah, these are fascinating documents, but I have no time to discuss them. Probably the most famous East German author was Christa Wolf. Many of you may have read her works. The most best known among them was a work called Cassandra. Christa Wolf was a true believer in socialism. She was considered a dissident, but she did not want to exile herself. She wanted to stay in East Germany and cooperate with the authorities. But she saw lots of abuses of power, and therefore she would make various remarks in her books which shocked the Communist Party. So she was censored, but she was so famous that they didn't want to squeeze her too hard. And in fact, in general, they're trying this, you see this in the archives, they're trying to manipulate writers. How can they do that? Well, with the carrot and the stick. So they can send people to prison, they can expel them from the Authors League. If you are expelled from the Authors Union, you can't have a literary career, you're finished. They can refuse you certain things that you want as a writer. What do you want? Well, you might want to read some of the West German press. You might want to buy a car. It usually took 15 to 20 years waiting to buy one of the little Trabis that were in East Germany. You might want to have a better apartment. You might want to move from one city to another. You can't do that without the permission of the party. You might want to get your child into a university. Not easy if you're suspected of being bourgeois. So what they are doing is they're offering these benefits to writers. And what the writers want most of all is the permission to travel. Everyone wanted not to quit East Germany, but to see the West. What was it like on the other side of the wall? They were fascinated by this, and so writers kept applying for permission to travel. Usually it was no, or if it was yes, you have to leave your husband or your wife behind. Now, I was giving you an example of Christa Wolf. So what you see is 2 pages from her famous novel, Cassandra. She was given permission to travel. She always came back. Her works were censored, but she could negotiate how much they would allow. And even require, when they cut passages, that they would put square brackets where the cut had occurred and ellipsis dots, dot, dot, dot. And they agreed to do this because they don't want to alienate their most famous writer. So in the case of Cassandra, they made several important cuts. And she agreed to this with the ellipsis dots. Do you see them in the upper left? Then, of course, she published the same book, Cassandra, in West Germany. And the West Germans took the passages that had been cut in the East German editions, and they would type out on a small piece of paper the actual words that had been cut. And these small pieces of paper were then circulating in East Germany, and you could slip them into a copy of the East German edition. So I was given a collection of these bits of paper, and you can see exactly how you would slip it into a book. If you read it, it doesn't seem so shocking at first, except if you read it as a piece of paper inserted in a taboo section, it comes alive. And reading became quite a different experience, I think, for Germans in East Germany than from West Germany. Well, I could go on and on. Tell me, Marina, if I'm taking too much time. Okay, I'll go fairly fast, but now we have a case of censorship in the 20th century, one in the 18th century, and I decided to study one in the 19th century in a very different context, but an authoritarian system, namely British India, the British Raj. I won't go into a lot of details, but this, of course, is imperialism, and the British controlled a vast subcontinent by force of arms. And yet, the British believed in the freedom of the press. It was something that they had won in 1685 when pre-publication censorship ceased to exist in England. And throughout the following centuries, the British were proud of the fact that no books were censored before they were published, and if they caused a scandal after they were published, the author could be brought to court for seditious libel. So it's libel law that is used to suppress books, and that did not work very well. In fact, the British press was pretty wild, especially compared with the French or the German in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So the British laws were applied to India. They had courts that followed British procedures, and the British masters of India wanted to believe that they were respecting the freedom of the press. In other words, liberalism. And the liberal ingredient in British imperialism, especially in India, is there from the very beginning. There are people like James Mill, John Stuart Mill, who worked for the Indian company. Macaulay was involved in, these are the famous 19th century liberals, in designing the educational system of India for Indian people. And at the end of the 19th century, John Morley was Secretary of State for India. He was one of the most famous liberals, and he had written a biography of Gladstone, the supreme liberal of 19th century England. So you have all of these liberals, this liberal tradition, and a respect for the freedom of the press behind an imperial power that is faced with a gigantic population of people who are now writing and publishing books. What to do about that? Well, there were several instances of books that created a scandal. They're not censored before publication because the British tradition is respected, but they're published and then there is a scandal and the author is brought to court, is tried for libel and sent to prison. This book, I don't have time to talk about it, but this was a book that, well, I'll tell you a little bit about it as an example of a book way back in 1861